Okay, Garrett, both leaders there seem to be kind of coming to this meeting with some skepticism. What is each country trying to get out of this?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to look at it. Look, for Mark Carney, he was elected in large measure as part of a backlash against President Trump and the way that the president has been talking about Canada and treating Canada in the form of these tariffs. Mark Carney has called it a betrayal. But upon landing in D.C. yesterday, as you can see there, he posted something on X basically saying that America and Canada are stronger when we work together, and that's what he wants to get back to. The president was right in his comments yesterday. Carney wants a deal. They want to get some kind of trade deal and get these tariffs on things like Canadian lumber and aluminum and steel and auto parts off the table. As for the president, he has said a wide variety of comments about Canada, suggesting he wants to get rid of artificial economic borders between the two countries and maybe even the borders altogether. Listen to this.
Are you also considering military force to annex and acquire Canada?
No, economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something. You get rid of that artificially drawn line.
President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never, ever happen.
Our old relationship, based on steadily increasing integration, is over.
It's hard to square all of it on us, so we will all find out together in the next hour and a half or so whether we get a more constructive meeting like what Mark Carney was suggesting or something else.
Brian, remind us, where exactly do the tariffs stand right now between these two countries, and are we already seeing impacts because of them?
Yeah, well, I mean, we just got a fresh international trade and goods report from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and they said that the trade deficit between the United States and Canada was around $4.9 billion just in terms of goods. And you can imagine that as the administration has been talking about wanting to lower the trade deficit and even provide a trade surplus in some cases to other countries, that's going to be the measuring stick for the administration in terms of trying to even trade here. But I think, as Garrett talked about, some of the major industries that are going to be a focus here, the automotive industry, which is so deeply intertwined with American manufacturing. There's so many goods that cross the border just between Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. Also things like lumber. I think a lot of people forget that there is currently a review from the Department of Commerce into whether or not they want to tariff lumber. That would be a big deal for Canada, which exports a lot of lumber to the United States. And of course, steel and aluminum tariffs, which have been in effect, that 25% tariff, that is very much a big part of the conversation as well. But broadly speaking, again, the story here is the United States has been front-loading a lot of imports ahead of these tariffs in anticipation of that. This report reflects that. The trade deficit widening, although interestingly, most of that on an international basis was actually coming from pharmaceutical goods. So it suggests that maybe we weren't bringing in consumer goods like furniture, electronics, as some may have thought. That suggests that as long as these tariffs are prolonged longer than maybe companies were expecting, it could be more of a supply chain issue once we get closer to the holidays than even a pricing issue. Yes, prices might rise if you can even find that item at the store, Anna.
And then there's, of course, the backlash in terms of the way people are behaving in wanting to punish America. If you are in Canada, right. Canadians, Catherine, have notably started shunning American products and foods. We know McDonald's observed an uptick in anti-American sentiment abroad, particularly in Canada, which could hurt their bottom line. Just how important is Canada when it comes to the U.S. economy?
Well, we are a much bigger share of Canada's trade than Canada is a share of our trade. But there are some industries in the United States that are very sensitive to sentiment in Canada and resentment among Canadians against the United States. Tourism is another great example of this. If you look at the data on trips planned by Canadians to the United States over the next few months, it has plummeted year over year. And that's because a lot of Canadians, well, first of all, don't want to patronize the United States after having been derided so much by Donald Trump, that they should just be simply a province of our country, but also because there's a lot of fear of what happens if you come here as a foreign tourist. Having to register with the government if you're here for longer than 30 days, these horror stories about people being detained at the border or otherwise mistreated. So there's still a lot of tension between these two countries. And if you are, for example, a tourism-focused business in Florida, which attracts a lot of Canadian snowbirds, that's going to be very painful for you. Many of the other kinds of commodities that Brian just laid out that Canada sells us, lumber, steel, aluminum, auto parts, lots of these kinds of products that we buy from them. Yes, it'll hurt Canada. It will also hurt the United States. We're buying that lumber because we need it to buy homes. We're buying their fossil fuels because we need it to heat our homes and run our factories and businesses. So no one's going to get out of this scot-free.
Here is the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, ahead of today's meeting. Listen to this.
They have been basically feeding off of us for decades upon decades upon decades, right? They have their socialist regime, and it's basically feeding off of America. I mean, the president calls that out all the time. Why do we make cars in Canada? Why do we do our films in Canada? Come on. So I think the president's going to have, I think it's going to be a fascinating meeting. I'm glad I'm going to be there listening, but it's going to be a fascinating meeting tomorrow. I just don't see how it works out so perfectly.
Brian, he claims that the U.S. has been getting ripped off for years, but let's remember, President Trump negotiated the last trade deal with our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. So where does this about-face come from, and what could the U.S. potentially get out of some kind of new deal with Canada?
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting rhetorical aspect of these negotiations between Canada, but also with Mexico as well, where the Trump administration is trying to frame the United States as being ripped off, even though the current framework for trade between those three countries is the USMCA, which was negotiated during his first term. Now, what's so interesting about the current tariffs that are putting into effect? Let's take, for example, the automotive tariffs. So there's an interesting provision inside the U.S., inside the current tariffs that says any sort of car part that comes, let's say, from Canada that is currently compliant with that framework that was negotiated under the first term, the USMCA, is not going to face a 25% tariff until the United States can figure out how much of that car part is not made in the United States. So it's like an exemption. It's like an asterisk to an asterisk, which suggests that the United States wants to scrap the entire USMCA and then maybe renegotiate a whole brand new trade agreement. So yes, there are these USMCA exemptions for some of these tariffs. But again, the heavy suggestion here is that the U.S. wants to scrap President Trump's own original negotiation, agreement and create a brand new one. What does that look like? We don't know, but you can imagine that meeting today between, Mark Carney and President Trump will be kind of the first step in figuring out what that might look like.
And you'd point out just how kind of tangled everything is. It is complicated. It's not so simple. Garrett, the White House just put out a release this morning touting National Small Business Week, even as small business owners keep saying that these tariffs will crush them. Here's one from Minnesota.
I have maybe 2 months worth left in my warehouse in Minnesota. And when that's gone, I have no more revenue. I cannot pay my employees. I cannot pay my bills. I cannot pay the loans, which I have leveraged my house against. So we could lose our house. I do not have the $230,000 that were just immediately dropped in front of me to get my products into the U.S.
Garrett, how's the White House planning to help this woman? Are there plans?
No, Anna, the short answer is no.
All right, so this morning, President Trump will welcome the Prime Minister of Canada to the White House, a neighborly visit that in any other era would be less of a headline. But when the American president continues to say that he wants to make Canada the 51st state, this face-to-face takes on a whole new level of meeting. This now is the first meeting of the leaders since Trump launched his trade war, Canada being one of his first targets, and also since Trump's anti-Canada rhetoric helped launch Prime Minister Mark Carney to victory in Canada's recent election. And around this relationship, there's a lot of fact-checking that is needed. So let's bring in CNN's Daniel Dale ahead of this Oval Office meet to walk through. Let's walk through some of the more recent statements that President Trump has made around all of this. You highlight something that he posted in March on social media, saying that Canada is one of the highest tariffing nations anywhere in the world. What are the facts around that?
The facts are that Canada is a low tariff country. The last international data we have from 2022, the World Bank published them, Canada was 102nd on a list of 137 countries' average tariffs. One of the countries it had lower average tariffs than, the United States. Now, President Trump often makes this claim in the context of Canada's agricultural tariffs. He highlights Canada's high dairy tariffs. He does not mention that those high dairy tariffs only kick in after a certain quantity of tariff-free U.S. exports to Canada, a certain quantity negotiated in his own USMCA are hit, and that the U.S. is not even close to hitting those maximum quantities. He also does not mention that the U.S. Department of Agriculture itself says on its website that almost all U.S. agricultural exports to Canada are tariff-free and barrier-free. So the milk stuff, the dairy stuff, that exists, but again, there are exemptions. And number two, those are the exception, not the rule.
And Daniel, over the weekend, President Trump took a shot at Canada's military spending. Let me play this.
Canada, they spend less money on military than practically any nation in the world. They pay NATO less than any nation.
What are the facts around this one?
This is not even close to true. Now, there is a kernel of truth, and presidents from both parties have long chided Canada for not spending more on its military. You hear that from some Canadian officials as well. But Canada is low on the NATO list. It's not last. So in terms of spending as a percentage of GDP, Canada is fifth lowest in NATO, not lower than any nation. And in terms of absolute military spending, so not factoring in the size of each country's economy, Canada is actually eighth highest in NATO. So absolute spending, eighth highest. And again, if you look at the world list, there's a think tank based in Sweden that tracks international military spending. Canada is the 16th highest absolute military spender in the world. So the president used the word practically here, but practically or not, Canada is not even close to the world's lowest military spender.
And Daniel, the president has continued to say that the United States has a massive trade deficit with Canada. So I think he talks about it in the ballpark of like $200 billion. What are you seeing? What's the truth in this as they walk into this meeting to ostensibly talk about this?
He says the number 200 billion almost every time he talks about Canada. It is wildly overstated. So the United States goods and services trade deficit with Canada in 2024 was about it was under 40 billion. So it's almost about 36 billion. I'm sorry. So he's multiplying it by several times.
Trump made a huge mistake there. Huge mistake in this meeting with Canada. This whole day thing that's going on. There's the public meeting, but there's behind the scene meetings all day. It's really a whole day process. And during that process, Trump has acted like a maniac, saying things that are at best, falsehoods, just lies. That's the best, to utter insane bile. And what he's demonstrating to his country, to the Canadian people, and to the world, third-party observers, is that he's an unhinged freak. There was an opportunity, I suppose, for Trump, theoretically. We know this wasn't going to happen, but theoretically, there was an opportunity for him to look gracious, to look kind, to look measured, to make a clear case for his tariffs, to, I guess, make a clear case for, here's why Canada should be the 51st state, all of this. And he did none of that. No one in the last 6 months, however long Trump is, from his election day to now, no one has made a worse case for Trump's policy towards Canada than Donald Trump today. No one has made a worse case for it. Not even other MAGA freaks. The single worst arguments made for Trump have been made by Trump today. Huge error. If you thought there was any chance that his plans with Canada could succeed, if you thought there was any chance, then he destroyed them himself in seconds.